Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either an interview with a guest or multiple guests or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this week's episode, I'm unpacking a paper titled Reconceptualizing Music Making, Music Technology and Freedom in the Age of Neoliberalism. And this paper was written by Kathy Benedict and Jared O'Leary. Apologies if I mispronounced any names. I'm just kidding. I actually was the co-author for this. But it heavily relates to an episode that came out 2 weeks ago, so it made sense to tie this in with that particular episode, which I do link to in the show notes, which includes a direct link to this free paper, and you can find that in the app that you're listening to this on by clicking the link in the description or by simply going to jaredoleary.com, where there are hundreds, if not thousands, of free computer science education resources, including a link to the curriculum that I create for free at Boot Up Professional Development, which is the nonprofit that I work for. And you can learn more about Boot Up and the PD at bootuppd.org. All right, here's the abstract for this particular paper. Quote, recent initiatives by for-profit corporations and funding measures instituted by governments intended to support the preparation of students for careers in computer science and technology. Although such initiatives and measures can indeed increase opportunities for students' engagement with computer science and technology in K-12 schools, we question whose needs are being served, for what purposes, and at what cost. In particular, we ask whether music educators might be complicit in advancing technology that subordinates human needs, specifically students' interests in making music in their own creative ways, to modes of production that benefit certain dominant commercial interests in society. After discussing how current computer technology narrows students' choices, we counter this determinism by highlighting a music subculture that creates and appropriates music technologies for music-related purposes. Our example of the chipscene illuminates how music educators might reconceptualize music making through modification of existing music technology and thereby restore students' freedom to reclaim making in the age of neoliberalism. End quote. If I had to summarize this paper into a single sentence, I would say that this paper explores the use of computer science practices to counter neoliberal influence on education. And again, you can find a link to this free paper in the show notes. All right, so in our introduction, we talk about digital natives and how the term is problematic in that it assumes, because students are growing up around technology, and therefore they must understand how to use it, or how to create with it, etc. This is problematic for a number of reasons. We kind of talk about some of those reasons in the introduction. We then talk about how computer science is being positioned as teaching students to create with technology rather than just consume with it, and how there's a ton of funding from organizations like National Science Foundation or for-profit institutions, etc., that positions code as, quote, a functional literacy necessary for meeting societal demands, end quote. It's from page 27. And then here's a quote from page 28. Quote, such initiatives are frequently supported by for-profit corporations that not only provide schools and organizations with significant amount of funding and technology, but that position themselves as industry experts in developing curricula and standards to prepare students for the future job market, end quote. And then a little bit further down on page 28, quote, coding in this context is put forth as functional and as serving the productive purposes, i.e. maintaining the status quo, of the dominant interest in society. We wonder in what ways music educators might be complicit in implementing technology that subordinates the human and musical needs of students to modes of production that benefit a highly commercial society, end quote. Okay, so then we go on to say that we are trying to reclaim the phrase to make music by describing hardware and software practices from computer science that can be used to make music in ways that are not typically discussed. So before we kind of unpack that a little bit more, we go into a next section that's titled Defining Technology. And so we talk about how technology is presented as this neutral or benign device or tool that people use and doesn't have biases. And among music educators, this isn't really talked about much. So I know this is much more common practice in computer science education. And there are many podcast episodes that kind of unpack this. So we highlight some of the biases in terms of like facial recognition technology, algorithms, tagging photos inappropriately, etc. And then here's a quote from page 29. Quote, there are biases embedded in all technology influencing how one experiences or uses it, moving us beyond defining technology simply as a tool. Technology must also be read in a much larger way as involving intertwined processes. The way in which technology is used to deliver, for example, educational experiences, content, and structures of accountability for both students and teachers extends an instrumental definition of technology to encompass a range of cultural, social, and productive processes, having powerful ramifications for the purpose of education. End quote. So the next section is on technological determinism and freedom. So in this section, we talk about how there is influence on education and educational contexts from devices themselves and corporations that are pushing devices or funding into schools. So for example, we talk about how Chromebooks and iPads or other tablets and whatnot are presented as solving issues in education, as being the tool that is needed to allow students to have a voice or be able to create, etc., which is inaccurate and problematic. But we also talk about how there's this push for industry experts having a say on what is taught in schools. For example, by having industry experts have a say on the standards or curriculum that schools will adopt or use in K-12 contexts. So here's a quote from pages 30 and 31. Quote, "Farming out policy into the hands of outside experts because we perceive these kinds of decisions to be outside our purview serves to ensure predatory capitalism's mode of governance, and the idea that computing skills are geared toward enabling students to succeed in the 21st century is clearly linked to jobs of the future, again underscoring a model of neoliberalism that is focused on the maximization of entrepreneurial freedoms and the unyielding logic of corporate profit-making." End quote. And then here's another quote from page 31. Quote, "Technology, as Stallman reminds us, can be said to serve its users only if it respects their freedom. What if the technology is designed to put chains on its users?" In both examples, and these are two among many, technology and computing curricula are presented as tools designed for instructional ends indifferent with respect to politics. Instead, as Giroux has observed, freedom and agency are defined through the prevailing ideology and principles of the market. Teachers simply need to equip every child with computing skills by tapping into the latest technology, whose potential simply awaits human direction. The presumed technological beneficence, unchecked, seemingly autonomous, and purportedly neutral, now coupled with the voracious corporate mentality in a society that no longer sees schooling as a public good, is a cause for alarm. End quote. So we end this section by saying that technology in schools is often being placed into curricula without any kind of critical reflection. And I would argue that computer science is often being placed into other subject areas without critical reflection. And I talk about that in the podcast titled The Subservient, Co-Equal, Effective, and Social Integration Styles and Their Implications for Computer Science. So check that one out if you haven't listened to that one. It talks about some of the problems with integration and how there are many different ways that you can do it that can be problematic, not just for students and teachers, but for computer science as a whole. So the quote that I just read for you is kind of like a segue into our next section titled Education as a Public Good. So this builds off of Giroux's work of education as a public good. So the example of like the devices being in the classrooms and then industry experts having a say on curriculum or standards or whatever are examples of neoliberal influence on education, at least according to like scholars like Giroux and others that we cite in this particular paper. And so we raise the questions on page 32 that says, quote, "When design decisions reside within commercial entities alone, whose interests are being served and for what purposes? How might music education curricula be constrained by those factors?" End quote. So for example, the devices limit you to certain hardware constraints and software constraints that can be used on those devices. And then the industry experts having an influence on the content being taught and the purposes that drive education, like getting a job as a computer scientist or whatever, all have an influence on what students learn and for what purposes, or even how they learn. And so we are raising this question of, well, whose interests are actually being served with this? Which resonates with the paper that I unpacked 2 weeks ago by Aman Yadav and Marie Heath. So check that one out if you haven't listened to that one. It's a wonderful paper. All right, so here's a quote for pages 32 and 33. And think of this in relation to integration of computer science into music education. It kind of is going to lead us into the main point of our paper that's coming up. Quote, "In music education contexts, where teachers have adopted many of these standards of judgment, the emphasis is on engaging with the music and technologies created by others, performing a pre-existing composition rather than composing an original composition, using a manufactured instrument rather than designing and building a new instrument, or engaging with music software rather than conceptualizing and developing new music software are just a few examples. Using the music, tools, or literacies developed by others, rather than challenging or crafting new technologies for being musical, diminishes his students' agency. However, Tobias suggests that by viewing technology through a critical lens, identifying multiple possibilities of technology, and envisioning how it might be used in ways that it was not originally intended, music educators can avoid deterministic analyses of the role that technologies play in music teaching and learning. End quote. Okay, so the way that integration is frequently talked about in other disciplines is to learn domain-specific content or to solve problems, etc. And while those are great, the thing that we're actually positioning here is a focus on creativity within the arts and specifically within music. So rather than using an instrument that an instrument manufacturer has created, why not have students design their own? Or hey, if you're using software to compose music or produce music or whatever, why not actually modify that software or create your own to do things that could not be done with the inherent constraints of the software that you're currently using? So this approach is a very different form of integration than simply solving problems or using computer science to learn content knowledge. So we unpack this more by providing a more concrete example of, well, what could this actually look like? So the section titled Music Technology in the Chip Scene elaborates on a lot of the research that I did for my dissertation. So we begin by talking about the demo scene and how when early computers and video game consoles were created, people would change the code to create what was called demos. So the demos would demonstrate like your prowess as a programmer in terms of creating unique visuals or sounds, etc. in early computing hardware. This led to like a subculture known as chiptunes or chip music or the chip scene, where people specifically focused on creating music with this like retro hardware. So for example, they would program software called trackers that allowed people to make music with like video game hardware that wasn't originally designed to make music, or at least didn't have software to make music with. So here's a quote from page 34. Quote, "Rather than accepting the inherent music-making limitations of early computer and video game hardware and software, people modified existing code or developed entirely new music-making software to create music with early sound chips. Further, many of the people who now create such software often openly share their source code with others and encourage modification or continuous development when the original developer must abandon work on a project." End quote. So this open source nature had a profound impact on the ways that people were able to create software or modify software to make music. And I actually have an upcoming interview that'll come out probably in a few weeks with somebody where we specifically talk about open source and how that can influence education. So stay tuned. In addition to like the software modifications and whatnot that are often discussed like in mod culture, which is like a culture around modifying video games to do something that they couldn't originally do. And I've done some podcasts that talk about mod culture, so check that out. Members of the chip scene also engage in hardware modification. So for example, people would modify the Nintendo Game Boys to be able to perform live with it. So they would bypass the internal amplifier, and then this would allow them to have a better signal with less noise that they could then plug into like a PA system. So that way they could perform music in a concert or record it using the trackers that were developed by members of the chip scene. And so while that's just one of many, many examples that I talk about in my dissertation for hardware modification, they also talk about designing and building devices specifically for making music with these retro consoles and computers. So here's a quote from pages 35 and 36. Quote, "These music-related practices and literacies are guided primarily by individual and group interests in their leisure, rather than corporations or industry experts seeking to fill computing jobs. Interestingly, some people within the chip scene regularly engage in entrepreneurial practices such as buying, selling, trading, promoting, and manufacturing a range of created or modified media, hardware, and software. While those who create or modify devices may appear only to have replaced one commercialized interest for another, some within the chip scene design music technologies expressly to facilitate modification. In other words, the technologies that these chip musicians create are not closed ecosystems limited to original design decisions and biases, but rather are meant to be altered by the people who use them in their leisure. Chip musicians encourage or design opportunities for such engagement in a variety of ways. For example, 1. Members of chiptune discussion forum often sell their music under a pay-what-you-want model and include original project files so people can learn from or remix their music. 2. Members sell hardware parts that can be combined or altered to modify existing hardware in an individually meaningful manner. And 3. Software developers within the chip scene often release source code for their creations and encourage others to modify their code to meet their own purposes. Each of these examples demonstrates how some people within the chip scene engage in commercialized practices through the products they create, which can establish new forms of determinism for the created or modified technologies. However, chip musicians often do so with the intention that users will have the freedom to alter these technologies further to better suit their own purposes. This approach enables people to be not only users, but makers of music and music technologies, in contrast with those music technologies and curricula that lead to technological and musical determinism, end quote. Okay, so that is like the main crux of this particular argument. Rather than just using devices as is, or software as is, we are encouraging people to modify not only the software, but the hardware for purposes not originally designed into that hardware or software, whether it's to eliminate biases, to solve problems, or to enable expressive mediums that couldn't be done without such modifications, for example, to be able to create chiptunes or whatever. The point is, we don't have to let the technologies, the hardwares and the softwares, or the corporations that donate those technologies determine how we use them. So this leads into the final section of this particular paper titled Lingering Questions and Potential Points of Dialogue, which reading through this, I wonder if that's what led to my lingering questions at the end of podcasts. I didn't realize that we use this verbiage in this paper that was written in 2019. So before I actually recorded the first episode of the podcast. It was kind of funny. So here's 2 quotes from page 36 in this section. Quote, "The examples above present a perspective on music technology that reflects the ontological shift that takes place when a user of commercialized music technologies becomes a creator or modifier of music technology for leisure." End quote. Then another quote. Quote, "We intend for the examples we have presented to provide a heuristic illustration for potential reconceptualizations of what it means to make music with and through music technologies." End quote. And then we provide some questions on pages 37. The first set is, quote, "How might a shift from music technologies created by others to creating and using music technologies shape music making and learning? What copyright laws might music educators need to consider when appropriating commercialized music technologies? Where is the place for and/or the balance between time spent making music technologies and making music with such technologies? Why might stakeholders consider such a shift as a move away from music making and learning? In what ways do these shifts help us to attend to democratic education and social justice, respect for others, critical inquiry, equity, freedom, civic courage, and concern for the collective good?" End quote. And then the next set of questions, quote, "However, we also wonder where such practices might be situated. In other words, would students code music technology software in a computer science class, a music technology class, an interdisciplinary class, or through collaborations between such classes? In an ideal setting, we might respond to such a question by asking, why does that matter?" End quote. And then finally, a quote from page 38, quote, "Rather than conceiving of music technologies as being constrained by immutable design decisions and biases, we invite music educators to explore the many creative possibilities that could arise through students' self-creation and self-modification of music technologies. Chiptune practices demonstrate one such possibility for students to circumvent technological determinism. Such an approach expands the notion of music making to include the creation and modification of hardware and software." End quote. Okay, so this leads to some of my lingering questions, to borrow some terminology from this particular paper. So the first one is, how might educators and hegemonic influences on education balance societal, organizational, group, and individual needs? Okay, so that was a mouthful. So for example, a societal need might be the need to collaborate on combating climate change. An organizational need might be corporations who need qualified candidates for open jobs. A group need might be removing systemic barriers for marginalized identities. And then an individual need might be just the goals and desires of individuals. These are all worthwhile causes that could be focused on within schools. But what I'm wondering out loud is, why do people and the broader discourse focus on one over another? So for example, we critique organizational needs in this paper, but they're still valid needs. While it is problematic that corporations are having a say on what students learn, they do have a need for qualified candidates. And while I forefront individual and group needs over organizational, the broader societal needs also need to be addressed. So this is where I think, as I mentioned previously, that multi-perspectivalism is key. I don't think we should have school or a single discipline focus on one set of needs while ignoring the others. So we shouldn't just cater to for-profit institutions just because they give us funding and because they need jobs filled. But we also shouldn't just focus on individual needs. We need to also think about group needs and societal needs. But I don't know what that balance looks like. So let's zoom out and look at education in a K-12 setting. Like, which classes should focus on one more than another? But then if we look at individual classes, what's the balance between these different needs within that class or that domain or discipline? So for computer science, how do we balance societal, organizational, group, and individual needs within the curriculum or within a given project, etc.? I don't really have an answer to it, but I think it's something that we could explore more and talk about more. And we need to do that, in my opinion, by zooming out. So while the paper discussed 2 weeks ago was critiquing organizational needs and focusing on centering group needs or individual needs, other papers have talked about how we need to focus more on societal needs. All of these areas are important for us to consider, as we shouldn't just focus on one at the cost of ignoring all others, in my opinion. But you might disagree with me, and that's okay. I'm happy to actually talk with you about it on the podcast. There's a contact me button on my website, in case you're interested. Now, the next question that I have is, when might the approach described in this paper position computer science within a subservient relationship with another discipline? So building off of the Bressler podcast that I did a couple months ago, if we use computer science to solve problems in a domain, or to encourage expressivity, or to enable expression of creativity or motion or whatever, or to learn domain-specific content, at what point is it putting computer science into a subservient relationship to other disciplines? And I don't have a clear answer to that. And I've mentioned that on many other episodes, but I say it as a critique to the writing that I did in collaboration with Kathy on this particular article. One might describe this approach as an interdiscipline, but you could also look at it as positioning computer science in a subservient relationship with music education. But it really depends on how you frame that or implement that. So while I obviously agree with a lot of what was written here because I helped write it, I still think it's important to critique it. But anyways, if you're interested in reading the actual paper, it is available for free, and you can find the link in the show notes or by going to jaredoleary.com, where there's a bunch of computer science education resources, as well as a link to bootuppd.org, which is the nonprofit I work for. And then there's also a bunch of gaming and drumming content, like literally several hundred hours worth of drumming content, and a bunch of gaming content that I keep adding daily, because I'm a nerd. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Stay tuned next week for another, and until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.